Good evening. Thank you for coming out this evening, and I will do my best to not wander about because we're taping this, and I'm told that it would be unfair to those who would watch it on video if I roamed about. Typically, I would go and bother you in the audience and make sure you were staying awake, but I have to stay here on my perch, which I will do. I'm going to talk to you about the history of the idea of the student, which is what my most recent book is about. It's called The Student, A Short History, and it examines the trajectory of the idea of us being a student from the Confucius to the present, with a very, very heavy emphasis on Western culture, on Europe and the United States. And so maybe in our conversation afterwards, people will have some suggestions about how I might broaden my lens to incorporate other ideas of being a student outside of the West. In the book, I do have an apology in the beginning of the book that it leaves out many traditions of learning that have been so vital. But as a university president, I have only a couple of months a year to write. And so I decided to focus my attention on the emergence of an idea of the student, which is still, I think, very powerful around the world, and especially in the West. Let me see if I do this correctly. There I am. All right. So I begin with three iconic teachers. And I did that because one of the things that defines what it means to be a student is to have a teacher. And again, we could talk about this in the conversational part of the evening, but it's certainly a lot harder. I don't know if it's impossible, but it's a lot harder to be a student if you don't have a teacher. And I chose three iconic teachers to write about at the beginning of my book. As you see here, Confucius, Socrates, and Jesus. So this could fit 3 volumes of many hundred pages each. I give it a chapter in the beginning of The Student, A Short History. And because I want to set these as ideal types of instruction, of being a teacher. Confucius, the notion is that you, as a student, you follow a path. If you're a student of Confucius, and I look at 3, the names are here, what you're learning is to follow the path of the master. In the case of Socrates, I also look at 3 students, although the city of Athens it stretches that notion a little bit. For Socrates, being a student is being a critical interlocutor, a critical conversation partner. And in the case of Jesus, as teacher, being a student of Jesus, being an apostle, these are all, of course, apostles. The last one spectacularly failed, apostle. It means imitating your teacher, imitating Jesus. So with Confucius, it's very important, as my Neo-Confucian friends tell me, that following a path doesn't just mean a narrowness necessarily, doesn't just mean that you are only walking in the steps of your teacher narrowly conceived, because these 3 followers of Confucius, they did that very differently. One with kind of martial enthusiasm, another with great piety, and so there are different ways of following the path of Confucius. And part of being a good student of Confucius meant to find your own way of following a path. Finding your own way, but still following the path of the master, as Confucius is often called in the texts that have come down to us. Socrates, for Americans, and I think it's still true in Europe, Socrates is the uber teacher. He is of these iconic teachers, he's the most familiar to American students today. And Socrates' teaching, his core theme comes down to us as what we call today critical thinking, especially in the United States. It seems like everybody's in favor of very little these days. You can pick a fight with people about almost anything, right? Because there's so much division in the world. But one thing almost all academics agree on in the United States is that we need more critical thinking. And so, of course, being a contrarian myself, I wrote a piece some years ago, it's in Beyond the University, that critical thinking is overrated. That and because what Socrates did, whereas Confucius had followed this path, Socrates, his method with his students was to say, see that guy over there? He has people following him. But let's go talk to him and I'll show you he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'll show you that his so-called knowledge is built on sand. And so what his young interlocutors learn is what we positively call critical thinking. But what they also learn is that the highest virtue is to be suspicious of everyone. And so my criticism of this tradition is that when one pushes on this a little bit, it's very clear that although suspicion is a good thing sometimes, to think of it as the highest virtue, as the only thing you can agree with people about, shows a kind of sickness in the culture. We can come back and talk about that. But nonetheless, despite the fact that I'm critical of it, it still remains extremely powerful as a vehicle for understanding what it means to learn things, to be in the situation of a learner and a critical interlocutor. And then in the case of Jesus, this idea of imitating a life. In Christianity, there's for centuries and centuries, it's so important that we learn not just to analyze what Jesus said, not just to read the texts, but to imitate a way of being. And so these three paths, following your teacher's path, learning to be suspicious, and imitating a virtuous life, these come down to us as iconic modes of teaching and hence of learning. So after this introduction in Beyond the student, a short history, I spend a couple of chapters on what it meant to be a student before there were very many schools. Because the easy way to say, oh, I know what a student is somebody who's in a school. But before there were schools, before most people went to schools, there was a state akin to studenthood, if I could use that word. And what young people were supposed to learn before they were viewed as mature adults, I think we can offer generalizations about. And here are the three things that I took away from this being a student before schooling is institutionalized. What young people are supposed to achieve in their student years is independence. What does independence mean in this context? Very narrowly, it means that you don't need money from your parents. So I have 3 children. One of them has yet to learn this. That's a joke. You can laugh whenever you feel like it. Thank you very much. No, I don't know. Maybe this is different in Bangalore than it is in New York. But there's a great moaning of parents whose children go to university, graduate, and then come home and live in in their old room. If the first week it seems very nice, but for the parents, but it gets old quickly, because what you want from being a student is that you are not going to be dependent on the people who sent you to school. So economic autonomy, independence as economic autonomy, was absolutely crucial for the notion of graduating from being a student in the pre-modern period in the West. But there's a second factor that often is overlooked. I mean, we all know that the point of learning skills, whether it's farming or a trade, is that you can become economically independent. But the other aspect of moving through your student years is to learn how to be integrated into a community. Your parents have a household in a village, let's say, or they're working on someone's farm, or they have a trade in a town. They are not just individuals in that picture. They are members of communities. And what you're supposed to learn while you're a student in this pre-modern period is how to be economically independent and to become a member of the community on your own terms or in your own right. So integration and autonomy. And that often means, in some, that you have the capacity to set up your own household. That it usually means marriage. And most especially, it means that you are seen by your community as an autonomous yet integrated member of that community. And so the period of studenthood is the period between infancy or total dependence and autonomy and integration. This period of learning to stand on your own feet, but in the context of community. The way many people learned about that process, or how to fully engage that process, was by being apprentices. And in the United States these days, there's talk of energizing an apprenticeship program. And I look at broadly at apprenticeship across Western Europe, and I decided to tell the story of the basic contractual arrangements that apprenticeships entailed by apprenticeships. Things like you agreed to be respectful to your master. You agreed not to have romantic relationships with the daughters and sons of your master. You agreed not to get drunk too often. These are all in the contracts we have. And so I talk about that. These are basic things that historians of the period know well. But then I decided to write about failed apprenticeships. And here I could just, as an aside, I was a student of Michel Foucault's many years ago, and I was working on French intellectual history, and I was very much influenced by Foucault's approach to the past, which is really to say, don't look at achievements, look at failures. If you want to know about X, look at what happens when X doesn't work. Look at the underside of whatever you think you want to study. For a long time, I worked on the history of memory. And I decided, in this Foucauldian approach, that instead of looking at memory straight, I would say, how do people understand disorders of memory? Because if you understand the disorder, then you can understand the normative values that go into creating the order. In this case, in order to understand apprenticeships, I looked at some odd apprenticeships, women apprenticeships in London, like Eleanor Moseley, who starts off as a milliner and winds up employing many, many young girls as milliners. And by virtue of their apprenticeship with her, they go off to set up their own shops, independent economic agents that are part of a community, in this case, the City of London. But then my failed apprenticeships, I focused on two because they're such wonderful figures and such interesting stories, I think. The first is Ben Franklin. I don't know how well known Ben Franklin is in India, but in America, Ben Franklin is like, I don't know, he's as familiar as coffee with milk in it or something like that. I mean, he's on the currency. When you're a child, you learn about Ben Franklin's exploits as a scientist, and as a member of the founding generation of the United States. And so I look at Franklin and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the political philosopher. I'll just give you a taste of why their apprenticeships failed. I do think it's interesting in light of what is to come in the argument about being a student in the modern period. Franklin wants to be a sailor. He's growing up in colonial America, and he wants to go off to sea as a adventurous young man might. But one of his siblings died in a shipwreck, and so his parents are not sending him on a boat. That's off limits. And so they don't have enough money for him to become an intellectual or a clergyman. And so they send him to work with his brother, who prints a newspaper in Boston. And when they mean send him to work, that means that he has a contract with his brother that says that his brother will feed him and employ him all day and give him a place to live for a certain number of years. And basically Ben has to do whatever his older brother says for that period until he takes the freedom, is what the expression is, for no longer being an apprentice. The thing with Franklin, though, is he's just too good at everything. So while he's working for his brother, he's learning how to set type, he's learning how to edit things, he's learning how to distribute newspapers. He starts writing columns, but under pseudonyms, like under a woman's name. And his great misfortune is he's an extremely talented writer, and so the columns become very famous. And his brother is quite annoyed because the regular columns in the paper don't do that well. Then everybody's reading Ms. Dogood, I think is one of the pseudonyms. And finally, Ben Franklin's unmasked. And his brother is furious at the older brother is furious at the younger brother, the apprentice's success. And they come to blows, and it's a difficult situation. Eventually, Ben Franklin's older brother is arrested because he's writing too much protest material against the British. And the family arranged for the younger brother to have a secret contract where he would make believe he's running the paper, but actually still be indentured to his older brother. And Ben Franklin said, I could have done this, but my older brother, and it's a beautiful phrase, I think, he beat me more than was necessary. Beat me more than was necessary. And because Franklin says, I deserve to be beaten a few times. I was, I was a very obnoxious young person and did a lot of bad things. But at some point, it just got too brutal. And Franklin realizes that although he has a contract, since the contract is secret, you can't enforce it. Right? He can't take him to court because it's a secret contract, and the older brother is on the outs with the British authorities. So Ben Franklin escapes to Philadelphia and sets up his own newspaper, sets up his own university, sets up his own science experiments, and becomes the kind of toast of the colonies, and eventually one of the founders of the United States of America. Around the same time, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's father, his mother died right after Jean-Jacques was born. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's father sends him to work for an engraver. And Rousseau also says that as an apprentice, he was subject to so much physical violence. And Rousseau says, what did I learn from working for a tyrant? I learned not so much to be a better engraver, which is what the master wanted. He said, I learned to do everything I could to annoy the master. So he said things like, I didn't really like let's pretend this is a cup of coffee. I didn't really like coffee, but I knew this was my master's coffee, so I would steal it and drink it. Yeah. I had no taste for fruit. Rousseau says, but because the master hid all the fruit in a certain part of the apartment, I stole it. Which is actually that becomes the core of Rousseau's political philosophy, which is that modernity corrupts us because we desire only the things that other people teach us to desire. Rousseau said, what did my master teach me? He taught me to be perverse. That is, the only things I wanted were the things that, not that I really wanted, but that would annoy him. And so Rousseau is out one day on his day off, walking around Geneva, which is where he was apprenticed, and he came back too late. And in those days, they locked the gates of the city. And he realized if he went back, he was going to be beaten ever more severely. And so he fled into the arms of an older woman named Madame de Verhain, and becomes, over time, a great composer of opera, a great political philosopher, and a failed apprentice. Why did these two guys fail as being students, as apprentices? They failed because they wanted something that the old system couldn't give them, which was freedom. And so the argument of the second half of the Student of Short History is that in the modern and contemporary periods, the idea of being a student, a good student, is linked to the idea of freedom. And so the figure I focus on here is Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, who says in the essay, What is Enlightenment? Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. You still act like a child, not because you have to. I have a grandson. He acts like a child because he can't do a lot of stuff. I have another child who's quite capable of doing lots of things, but he acts like a child because he pushes himself to the point of dependence. He has self-incurred immaturity. And what happens in the modern world is that being a student gets linked to liberating yourself from your own immaturity. Which means, Kant says, and I go on to emphasize, it means liberating yourself so that you can think for yourself. That you have ideas that can withstand free and public examination. That being a student in the modern and contemporary world means practicing freedom. Now, Tagore said much the same thing, a century and a half later, but many people in education in the modern period push back against that because they think of education more as training or as imitation. But this notion of being a student as the time in which you learn to think for yourself in the company of others, standing on your own feet intellectually, this becomes the core modern idea of being a student. Another figure that I thought of as really vital for this process was the American philosopher and writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. He took this idea of standing on your own feet intellectually, thinking for yourself in the company of others, and he radicalized it. He saw it as a romantic notion. Here's Emerson: higher education should ignite students' spirit and intelligence with the materials from nature and the past, not merely show them how to digest the materials. Colleges can only serve us, he wrote, when they aim not to drill, but to create. When they gather from every ray of various genius to their hospitable halls, and by their concentrated fires, set the hearts of the youth aflame. So Emerson is different from Kant certainly in tone, in the emotional register he uses. For Kant, it's thinking for yourself in the company of others in a very abstract way. For Emerson, it's learning to find your passions and actualize them with concentrated fire. So throughout the 1800s, especially in Germany and eventually in the United States, the notion of practicing freedom as the core of studenthood becomes more and more popular. It gets linked to the ideal of liberal education. In German, we use the phrase Bildung for that, the notion that being a student is the time when you acquire the traits of character, the skills, and the spirit of living on your own terms within a community. And that ideal of liberal education includes developing your capacity economically, but it's not at all limited to that. And I spent some time in that part of the book writing about being a student in Germany in the 1800s and the freedoms that German students and universities were given. They were extensive. I don't know how it is here at Azim University or other universities in India. I mean, in Germany in the late 1800s, nobody told you to go to class. Nobody told you what classes to take. You were free to choose. And so the Americans who went to Germany on a kind of study abroad semester or year, they were quite shocked because what they saw with German students, they basically hung out in bars and they got into fights and there was a lot of dueling. There was a lot of dueling with swords. And the Americans were appalled because we Americans are very moral people, you may have heard. You know, we're easily appalled. Anyway, I don't know how moral we are. They're easily appalled. But then they said, listen, what German universities are giving their students, which we Americans were not giving, is the freedom to choose their subjects, freedom to chart their own intellectual paths, the freedom to say, I'm not going to do that today and then fail. The professors did what they do. And what the Americans noticed is in that first year or two, the students waste a fair amount of time growing up. But then they go to the lecture, as you have today, not because you're going to get a check mark or a credit. You go because you want to be there. You want to learn. And that ethos is that of learning freedom by practicing it, not by being forced to take a math course or being forced to take a history course, being forced to take something else, but learning because you are moved to so learn. That becomes vital in the modern university as Germany builds it and then America, as we often do, appropriates it in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I talk about two spectacular American intellectuals, W.E.B. Du Bois and Jane Addams. Du Bois was this extraordinary student, one of the great students in American history. He grew up in not far from where I live in Massachusetts, Great Barrington, tiny little town in Massachusetts, one of the few black people in the town when he grew up. And so the town, he was a genius kid. They didn't really know what to do with him. And so they took up a collection to send him to a university in the South of the United States where he would see other black kids because in Western Massachusetts, there were very few and far between. And W.E.B. Du Bois, he didn't seem to care because racism was not yet a big part of his life. He learned about racism when he went to school in the southern part of the United States and realized he couldn't go off campus because if he went off campus as a black person, white people might beat him up or worse. He learned about black culture in America for the first time when he went to a college in the South of the United States, and he excelled in everything he did in Hampton. And then he went up to Harvard, again, one of the few black students at Harvard at the time, and he won every prize and smashed every record. And he studied with William James and Santa Ana and the great lights of the day, and eventually got a scholarship to go to Germany. And Du Bois is one of these intellectuals that just loved being a student. You may know people like this. You may be a person like this yourself. He just couldn't get enough of learning. It wasn't so much about finishing a paper or doing a project. It was just that experience of learning new things. And so when Du Bois goes to Germany, he feels so free, he says. I mean, because he wasn't looked at as a black person. He was just looked at as a student. He is shocked, he says, when he gets off, he goes on a boat ride, a tour with a German family, and one of the young women proposes marriage to him. And he was shocked. He thought he was going to get killed by these white people. And they didn't think of him as a black person. They just thought of him as this incredibly interesting, smart, kind, handsome man. And Du Bois spends a couple of years in Germany on a scholarship. And, you can't, for me, it's like a hungry person at a buffet. He just could keep going and going and going. but until the scholarship ran out. And it's very sad at the end of this, he writes in his autobiography, he's on the boat and he sees himself coming back into New York Harbor. And he says, I'm coming, and he uses more offensive language. I won't use it here, but I'm coming back where people will hate me because I'm black. Welcome home. And so for him, being a student was practicing freedom. I mean, it just was that feeling you sometimes get when you're learning and you don't see the time go by, you don't care about a grade, you just feel like you're getting new things that make you feel more human, more alive. The other person who did that so spectacularly was Jane Addams, but she had a different experience. Jane Addams grew up in the late 1800s in Illinois, and there, a girl going to college was very unusual. And Jane Addams was an unusual girl. She was so smart. Everyone knew how smart she was. She was clearly superior intelligence. But her father said, listen, but Jane, you're a girl. You're kind of fragile. And so he said, why don't you go to this convent school, a religious school just for girls. And while you're there, you see how you do. And he was hoping she'd get over the desire to be a student, really, I think. And she goes to the school, she's the editor of the paper, and she gets all the prizes, and she's knocking the ball out of the park. And then she says, okay, Daddy, I can go to Smith College, where she really wanted to go and become a doctor. And he said, well, you're still a girl, you're still fragile. And so she's very frustrated by this. And then her father passes away. I'm not supposed to say pass away, apparently. No. No. So her father passes away, but Jane Addams doesn't. She gets the money, but she does not actually go off to the college I did a lot of work on Freud, and we Freudians know that the most powerful father is a dead father. And so Jane Addams actually decides, I'm not going to go to college, even though her father's not there to stop her. She goes to Europe on a tour with some of her friends. And here's the point, finally. Here's the point. She's walking across the street in London, and she sees somebody crossing the street down the road from her. And this fella's run over by a horse-drawn cab. Just not, terrible accident. And what does Jane Addams do in this moment of crisis? She thinks of de Musset, who has a poem in which he quotes Homer, who has a poem in which he talks about a man being run over by a horse. And she feels herself doing this. In the face of human tragedy, what does she do? She thinks about a book about an event. And she stops herself and says, this is what being a student means? This is what learning means? No, she says. I should learn to practice freedom. And for Jane Addams, practicing freedom meant serving others. So she goes back to Chicago. She establishes an institution called Hull House, the greatest aid society for immigrants in the United States. She becomes a radical pacifist in the United States, becomes very popular until World War I, when then the Americans want to go to war, then they hate her. But she sticks to her, not guns, she sticks to her vocation, she sticks to her ideals, which is being a student by practicing freedom and developing a sensibility of sympathy. Because sometimes people think being a student means learning for yourself. Du Bois and Addams, especially Jane Addams, shows that being a student can be learning so that you can react more pragmatically, more powerfully, more compassionately to people who need you, who are right around you. Finally, I spend some time in the book talking about the different kinds of students that America has in colleges in the 20th century. And we could talk more about this in the conversational part of the evening, if you would like. And they range from I'll go in reverse order, from the nerds. I don't know if this is a word that has resonance here in India. Yes, it does. So, a nerd, I always said I was a nerd at Wesleyan, when I was an undergraduate. I was so afraid that I didn't know, and I didn't know anything, that I studied all the time. I actually learned to do transcendental meditation when I was a student in the 70s. It was a thing in America. But I learned to do meditation so that I wouldn't have to sleep, so I could study more, which was not what my meditation teacher thought was a good idea. That's what a nerd does, right? Or grind, somebody who just tries to work for the institution. But American colleges have often produced radicals and free spirits. And so you see in American politics, I'm not sure this happens in India to the same extent, you can tell me, in American politics, studenthood is a flashpoint for politicians. Especially from the conservatives these days, or I would call it right-wing authoritarians in the United States. They love attacking college students. Why? Because college students tend to be more radical. They tend to be free spirits. They tend not to fit in. In the 1960s, we had the generation gap, lots of complaints from older people about the young people not understanding anything. In the 1990s in the United States, we had lots of complaints about political correctness. If you were an academic and you wanted to make money writing a book, those are hard things to do together, being an academic and making money writing a book. You complained about political correctness, that college students today don't think freely because they're all trying to be more politically correct than the next person. That was in the 1990s, but it's very similar to what we see today in the United States. And probably you have conversations about this here in India, about woke culture. Is this a term you see here? And woke culture, which is just racialized notion of political correctness. But the complaint is that students today on college campuses are unlike when I was a young person. They don't think for themselves. And I take these complaints very skeptically. I think these is what happens when you get to be, I'm 66, when you get to be my age, you start complaining about young people. Why? And some people start quite early, actually. Why? Because you're not young anymore, and and it hurts, right? And so you find ways to complain about young people. And in the United States, this is a real industry in academia. And I think it's a terrible thing, because if you're a teacher, you should not complain about students. You should teach them. And if you can't teach them, it's not their fault. And I think that this is but it's easier to say it's their fault than to actually say, I can't connect to these students today, which is hard as you get older. My students today disagree with me about many things, and they tell me all the time. But my job as a teacher is to find a way to connect to them so that they can have the experience that I so valued, which was practicing freedom in a way that allowed me to stand on my own feet in the company of others. So finally, and I think this is getting towards maybe the last slide, I conclude by calling for an understanding about the links between being a college student and practicing freedom, an ethos of experimentation and openness. In the US, and I suspect in some places here in India, there's a great push to have university students become more capable of contributing to the economy, to have university students really focus on those skills that will, on day one, give them a job that pays their bills and contributes to the economy. What I argue in the student is that although it is so important to be economically independent, it was in the pre-modern period, it is not enough. That being a student today should be a combination of the three iconic teachers' methodologies: following a path, which includes learning skills, developing crafts. It has to include critical questioning, because Lord knows there's so much unreliable information out there that you need the skills of critical thinking to sort through that information, to know when you're being lied to, especially by people with power. And emulation or imitation also is a core idea of learning that comes through an examination of the history of being a student. Because what is empathy if it's not being able to see yourself in the shoes of another? Emulation is a technique of not just standing in your own place, but trying to stand in the shoes of another. So I do believe that, that being a student is this ethos of practicing freedom so that you can think for yourself in the company of others. Okay, to think for yourself in the company of others. And I try, as you can hear, I hope you can hear, I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, right? In other words, think for yourself may seem quite isolating if you're in the crowd and you're thinking for yourself. But what I'm arguing for is a kind of a student life that would take very seriously that you're always entangled with others. You're never just on your own. But at the same time, to aspire to not think someone else's thoughts, to not adopt someone else's attitudes, to not just imitate someone else's way of life, but to find through the combination of those techniques, those practices, find a freedom that serves you and the people around you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Roth. Very insightful, scintillating, and an extraordinarily complex topic called the student, but you helped us understand quite a few things, the entire book that you have written. So I don't think I have the wherewithal to emulate you on the scintillating levels, nor am I going to ask such questions which might generate the level of curiosity that many audience may have. So I would keep myself to few sort of overture of sorts.
Okay.
And then let's open it to the wider audience and see what they would have. It's an extraordinarily interesting way that you have presented the student sort of idea. I'm going to begin with the hard one, which is your take on Socrates.
Yes.
I'm actually wondering whether you tried very deliberately somewhat being provocative, that the critical thinking is some kind of a problematic, and I suppose the way you presented Socrates. I was remembering actually in part, the economic philosopher Amartya Sen,
yes,
and his idea of argumentative Indian, right? So in other words, the imagination of Indian as somebody who thrives and revels in argumentation, which I'm equating with, for instance, in much of the Greek philosophy, this agonism and this idea of engagement with each other. I'm sure Sen did not visualize the today's TV debates as argumentative Indian, obviously. The today's TV debates obviously are cross-purpose conversations, proxy conversation to your audience. Quite like you said, American TV, obviously, I suppose the politicians today are not talking to one another, but they're talking to their, kind of echo chambers of sorts, right? So when that kind of transformation happened, I understand. That I won't consider as critical thinking. But critical thinking for me is an argumentative person in an agonistic way engaging with each other. So would you consider somewhat more charitable sort of view on Socrates?
For sure. And I mean, the first thing is that the only way to really pay homage to Socrates would be by being critical of Socrates, right? So, right. So there's that for starters. When I wrote a piece called Beyond Critical Thinking some years ago, because I felt that that Socratic skepticism was so important for discerning true information or reliable information and unreliable information, for taking people down a peg who have power and confidence but don't really know what they're talking about. Although absolutely crucial. What I found was that among my students and some of my colleagues, this became a posture that allowed them to not open themselves up to anything. So that in this argumentative mode, they were very unlikely to appreciate something that was beautiful, to be moved by something that was glorious. They would be much more capable of saying, oh, you all found that glorious? That's because you're not very bright. Because if you look at behind the curtain, it's not so glorious. Right. And so what I found, and I see this with my students all the time, especially the very smart ones, that they'll say, this book we're reading, they'll say to me something like this: Kant says, enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. I think Kant is wrong because Kant was, and I stop them and I say, no one cares what you think about Kant. I don't care what you think about Kant. I want you to tell me what Kant said and why Kant said it. Right. But they're so used to being given flowers or good grades for taking things down a peg, that they sometimes don't try to understand why the text has seemed to others as powerful as it seemed. And in the realm of aesthetics, I think it's even more pronounced that I teach a course on philosophy in the movies. And we watch mostly old films, old Hollywood films. Right. And I tell the students that they should try to put themselves in a position where they are seduced by the film, because they're really good at preventing themselves from being seduced by anything, a work of art. Right. They're very good at being skeptical. But I say, okay, for purposes of this class, or at least this week, try to put yourself, move your chair, whatever you have to do, so that you can think this is the greatest thing you've ever seen. And that means you're opening your heart. That means not being prematurely critical, because I think criticism can come later, but it's really hard to love something when you start off being critical of it.
Right. But, what you are imagining as a very rational, sequential process obviously is not the way learning happens. You know better than all others here. So is it not, therefore, a kind of pushback on somebody's enthusiasm of raising questions, right? So I'll just say something, right? So I remember C.B. Macpherson's work, the Canadian political philosopher, who actually said, liberalism is not so democratic in its origins. It's only through consistent and persistent kind of questioning from various quarters that actually it transformed into liberal democracy, right? So if that is so essential for being a transformative in democratic process, and I suppose any kind of question, is it not that we should welcome rather than giving a pushback?
I think it's necessary, but not sufficient. Right. And so I do think there are times to be welcoming of that. But so if I had a class where everybody was eagerly trying to like everything that I liked and try to anticipate, then I would do something quite different. But I find that American college students, they are trained to take things down. Okay. And a friend of mine, a person I admire quite a lot, is named Ibu Patel. He works in the United States on issues of pluralism, and he puts it this way: that there's a season for this criticism, right? And there's another season when you also want people to say, I really love something. So if you I don't know what, I'll try the cricket analogy.
Right.
So if you're going to a cricket match with, I don't know, someone like a Socratic, post-Marxist, anti-sports person, and you're watching the cricket match with this person, and every time something really exciting happens, this person turns to you and says, do you know those people are exploited, and it's bad for the environment, and it's encouraging male violence? I don't know, all these things we could say.
Right.
And you're like, I want to watch that. That was a beautiful moment in the game just now. And so I think that there's a season for putting yourself in a position where you can see how beautiful that game is or the art is. And, you can ask also those critical questions.
Right. My last question on the students. So therefore, I'm very curious as to what has been the response of young students to your The Student book.
So it's hard for me to say. The response has been good so far, in the sense that I've gotten messages from students in Egypt and in Turkey and in China, and asking to translate the book, and I think I've given a bunch of talks in the United States. It's been positive. It's funny at Wesleyan, because I'm the boss, I'm the president. The people there are more inclined to the Socratic approach, where they'll say, oh, you say this about practicing freedom, Roth, but you limit our ability to protest you, or you're still not supporting this cause that we support. And I take that as a backhanded compliment, in other words, that they're acting like good students by being questioning and in some ways emulating the work of their teacher. My efforts in the United States have been around trying to create a broader platform for intellectual diversity in American colleges and universities. There is a kind of groupthink among American college students, I fear, that we as teachers should try to disrupt. We were talking before we started about my teacher, Victor Gurevich, with whom I did a book of letters between the Marxist philosopher Alexander Kojev and the sometimes called conservative philosopher Leo Strauss. And I realized when I did this work with Victor Gurevich, who was my teacher, and I knew for many years, I never knew what he thought about politics.
Right.
I mean, all I knew is that he would tell me, think more about that, or have you thought about the other side of this? And so as a teacher, if my students were praising something I wrote, which is unlikely, I would ask them, well, what about, and I would try to point to another side, because I do think it's very important for this notion of practicing freedom that students develop the agility to see things from someone else's point of view. And as a teacher, one of the things I love about working with students over all these years is they surprise me. Their points of view are quite different than I expect. And that's how I can learn, and I encourage them to learn.
Right. One last question before we open the floor is what actually in private I asked you, but I'm going to repeat my question. You are an uncommon historian in my understanding, whatever I try to look at your writings. And your methods seem to be neither completely history of ideas kind, nor is it conventional archival history kind. Right? You seem to have worked out something, maybe what you said, influence of Foucault, but not in genealogy in the dot sense, but through the vantage point of biographies or individual figures, etc. It looks very interesting. Could you just throw some light on how you evolved your method, what kind of things influenced you to think about history that way?
Sure, thank you for the question. So my first book was about psychoanalysis and politics, and called Psychoanalysis as History. And I was very influenced by this basic Freudian notion that, oh, it looks like this, so it's probably not that. It'll probably be something else, And although Foucault was in many ways an anti-Freudian, when I met him in, I guess it was the very early 80s, late 70s, I was very taken with his ability to show the underside of it looks like freedom, but it's really control, or it looks like liberation, but it's really another form of incarceration, et cetera. But at the same time, I thought, and talked with him about this, that he lacked any mechanism for legitimating action. It was always deconstruction. And so I became very concerned with the tendency among my peers and my students to actually get so much satisfaction out of taking things apart that the only people who were constructing things, building things, were people who weren't thinking about ideas very much at all. So I do think chronologically, I think historically, it's very important for me to look at things over time. But I have gotten great pleasure, that's the best I can do. I've gotten great pleasure for trying to write things for larger groups of people. I did a book on French Hegelianism. Yeah, 4 people read it. My mother kind of read it, but it was, you know, it's the book on French Hegelianism. Judith Butler and I wrote books around the same time about this subject, and it's the late 70s. But then I did an exhibition for the Getty Center when the Getty Museum opened, and I did an exhibition for the Library of Congress on Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. Millions of people saw those exhibitions. Right. And so I became very interested in trying to talk about ideas historically to a bigger audience. Right. As a teacher, as a curator, and when I can, as a writer. I think of myself as a historian, but many historians are suspicious because I don't spend as much time in archives as they do. But because they do, I can borrow their work. And
all right, thank you. So one clarification before we move to the questions. Would you like to take a set of questions and then respond, or would you go by question by question?
We go by question, but one at a time, unless we're running out of time, and then we can take a few.
All right. So could you raise your hands to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we'll hold, or maybe 6. We'll hold. I suppose we'll go. Fair enough. We'll go one by one. Yes, please. Yeah, please.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm Manigandan. I'm from Madurai. One will be an observation. 2 will be questions. The observation is I used to wonder why MIT Massachusetts has produced 100 Nobel Prizes in core subjects. It is multiple times all the universities put together in Asia. And it is the main reason why United States has economic and technology superpower. We should all agree that irrespective of challenges, technology transforms civilization. So as you're exactly, I was wondering why such one institution can transform civilization. It is because of freedom, one. And next is critical questioning. Freedom takes you out of the comfort zone. And when you are in comfort zone, you fail. And again, you are pointing that failures have to be measured. And at the end of the failure, if you are able to sustain the failures, then comes the success which can transform humanity as a whole. And that's what MIT is doing. So that's a great observation, and that is an observation. Then 2 questions. Again, it will be a critical thinking side. One is the making of the Los Alamos project of Manhattan Project, which it was released in Robert Oppenheimer. From your perspective, education, science, and it has led to, you know, Harry Truman finally declared that the 2 atom bombs had to be dropped to end the war and relieve the world. It was dropped to peace. What, in your opinion, is John Oppenheimer's consolidation, integration of other technologies, nuclear fusion of the scientists before? That is one question. That exactly that Los Alamos project, your analysis. That is a question.
Okay.
Second question is, how do you observe, Princeton University, we know of Albert Einstein. He spent at least 2 decades in, what influence did the university is having from Albert Einstein?
Okay, so
thank you for the observation.
Thank you for your observation. And and your questions. So I do think that, and I just actually watched Oppenheimer as I was flying here, to which I don't recommend. It's probably much better in a big theater with a full experience. But I think that one of the really interesting things about that period, that project, was that a group of competitive, skeptical, ambitious scientists / mathematicians, they had to park their egos in the service of a project. And these are people who had been very competitive with each other. I don't know if you know, there's this recent book, The Tyranny of Angels, something, Bill Eddington, which is about these mathematicians, and there's a novel, a recent novel, this is called Maniac, which is also about these extraordinarily competitive mathematicians. Didn't like each other, especially, because they were trying to be the bit better than the next guy. They subsumed their criticality. They parked their egos in the service of a mission, and partly because Oppenheimer had the authority, moral and intellectual, to do that. I can't really comment on the with any sophistication on the influence of Einstein on American culture, except to say he made it very cool to be very smart. And in other words, that Einstein, although very few people, myself included, really understand the nuances of the contribution, we recognize that theoretical work at the highest level could change the world for the better and also for the worse. And that rather than thinking theoretical work at the highest level was irrelevant, it was perhaps more relevant than anything else.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So one very quick observation, which is, from my own experience in university teaching, I think getting young minds to distinguish between skepticism and cynicism is where kind of the trick lies, right? And it's very, very hard to do it in a classroom. I mean, it's easier said than done, because of course they all want to come in and they all want to be really smart, and they're like, oh, Foucault got it wrong. And, Hegel, of course, was absolutely wrong, even to be, writing. And so on and so forth. So I think they're sort of, I've struggled myself to be able to do that, also to kind of move them from on the spectrum from opinion to judgment to argument, how do you even get them to understand that? And I think that the fact that many of us get PhDs and then run straight into classrooms with some teaching assistant's experience, but not really any longer training in pedagogy, also has consequences for how we look at learners today. But the question that I want to ask you, and that will be brief, I promise, is one of, how, because you spoke about apprentices, and these are apprentices both intellectual and manual, right? So people are learning what today we call vocational, but people who are doing things with their hands, from carpentry down to bookbinding to, who knows what all, butchery, baking, and there are people who are learning how to think and articulate ideas. So how does this distinction play out, if at all, in the conceptualization of a learner or a student? And what happens to this idea when disciplinary divisions and silos come into being with the sort of, with the receding of metaphysics and the disintegration, for lack of a better word, or the divergence of natural and moral philosophy into, the kind of structures we see today?
Well, it's another very large question, and let me comment on it briefly. I do think that the apprentice system had, as you know, at its core, giving you the ability to practice a trade, whatever that was, right? Engraving or printing a newspaper or whatever it was. But it wasn't limited to that. It also had to do with being part of a community and having certain basic moral considerations. I think that the students in the contemporary period have to not just acquire the ability to make a contribution through the trade or the skills, and not just by being better skeptics than their cousins or their fellow students, that students today should learn this combination of virtues and capacities to allow them to be lifelong learners, the phrase we use, right, to practice freedom over a long period of time. How we do that in the classroom, I think is my own experience is it comes from learning from the teachers you've had, rather than, at least in my own experience, rather than the study of pedagogy. I have friends who actually seem to learn like good tricks of the trade through the kind of study of pedagogy, like being an apprentice teacher. My daughter was a student teacher before she became a teacher in a classroom. What I found was I would think of my teachers who I loved, I was just thought they were the greatest, and try to be like them. But so I'll give you an example. When I was starting to teach at Princeton, I would go around like this in the classroom, and I would go up to people and I would talk to them like this, because I had a teacher at Wesleyan who did this all the time. But when I did it, people would shrink from me. They'd be, and so I went back to tell him. His name is Henry Abelhoff, is a master teacher. I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "You're too big." "You're too big, my dear," he said to me, because he was a little guy with wispy, had a lisp. He said, "You're scaring the hell out of the students." and so what I realized, and until he said it, it never occurred to me that I had to find my own way of giving what he gave, which, in other words, I still wanted to have people experience what I experienced in his classroom, but I had to find my own embodied way of doing that. It took practice, for me anyway. It took a lot of practice, and student responses. Because I think that my students are very angry, but if they want to go to the restroom, I tell them, don't come back during class. This is outrageous. Even my own children say it makes me a fascist. I said, well, if that wouldn't fascism, it's a lot worse than that being. But I try to have a certain kind of authority in the room, but at the same time, learn to listen better and to not scare the people in the front row.
Sorry, I think we'll take this row. I think there are two hands there.
And I'll be more brief, sorry.
I request if, in the interest of more questions, if you could be brief,
Sure.
that would be great.
So when you talked about certain professors who have a problem with political correctness and woke culture and everything, the first name that popped up was Jordan Peterson. And the only reason I know of him is because of how pervasive he is in social media. So I wanted, because someone like Confucius or Socrates, I don't think had a problem with social media back then, but now it is a big issue for, like, every student has access to it. So does the access to social media in any way alter the course of education, how teachers should go about it, or anything like that?
Yes, that's a great question, and I think it does. I'll give you just one example that I see from my students, which is that some people in class are afraid to say things in class that may prove wrong, let's say, or just offensive, because in class it doesn't matter. We establish a kind of friendship among ourselves, but someone might tweet it out and say, you know what Harry said in class, and then it goes to all these people they know, and they find it very threatening. And that changes things, because when we were in a class, even here we are in this room, we could say things to each other. We're not going to broadcast to the whole world. I mean, I've been taped, I guess, so I have to be careful. But there's that ethos that we're in a safe. I wrote a book called "Safe Enough Spaces." It's safe enough now. And so I do think that it has had a pernicious effect. It also has great virtues, I think. You can learn about other people's views, or I use it for bibliography because I'm such a nerd. I find other things to read on social media. But it does create, for some people, a fear of social criticism.
All right, there is one more hand, so just we'll finish and then move to this row.
So, am I audible?
Yeah.
So in India right now, people are fighting over their favorite social media influencers. and not over political issues. So, like, people know about like who won the National Influencer Award and not that election commissioner or election commissioner got resigned from his office. Yeah. So I believe like this is a kind of a political agenda, like who the people in power are playing it. So as a young generation, so my question is, how do we as a student, like who are able to look the whole picture from sitting behind, should do, because in a way, freedom is being taken from us and many people are still not aware of it. So the other is like, was there any situation like this in the history of United States, like where there was a political agenda to divert the people's attention from actual problems?
Yes, thank you very much. Very often in the history of the United States and other countries too, the easy way to divert people from problems is by starting a war. Right, and exporting social conflict through military adventurism, and Americans have been doing this a long time, but I think that the social media issue, it just reminds us that it's so important to have multiple sources of information. I mean, we all know that in the abstract. But it's so easy to curate your information flow so that you only hear the things that you are likely to believe, whatever side you're on. And it's harder, I mean, especially in these polarized times, to listen to people who you sharply disagree with on social media or elsewhere. But without multiple information flows, I think you don't have a chance of arriving at a sensible approach. Now, of course, if all your no matter if you have a lot of falsehoods, you're still going to have a bad view. But I think that as it is so much easier to get different information flows to your phone than it would have been in any, like buying newspapers or something before. So I think it's up to us as citizens to open ourselves to different channels of information.
All right. So we'll begin from here. So we'll take.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the function of integration into the community of education, specifically in the context of institutions of higher learning and sort of the modern, we have these very globalized, very technology forward institutions that create all of these connections in this global community, this international community. But at the same time, those institutions of higher learning can be quite isolated from other people in the spaces where they actually are. Yes. So, for example, if I go to my hometown, the fact that I have now gone to these institutions of higher learning, it marks me as I am no longer part of this community. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
That's a great question, a really important point. And I use Jane Addams as an example of someone who saw that herself in her own experience, that the more refined she got, the more detached she got from the communities of which she could be a part. And she would be encouraged to be even more refined and even more, because she finds these other micro communities of, in her case, let's say rich people or super educated people. But she was insensitive to the world because of her education. So education had curiously made her less sensitive to the world. What you want from education, of course, is to be more open to the world as well as being more critical of things. So we see this at Wesleyan in a big way. We have created community engagement opportunities for students. Wesleyan is in a small American city that has had its ups and downs. economically. And we have hundreds of students who in a small school of 3,000, who are volunteering in the schools, who are working in the political life of the city. We've started this year something called Democracy 2024. I think the next series of elections in the United States could be very, very important. And so we're trying to get not only our own students, but students all over the country to not be cynical about American politics, which is easy to be. It's really easy, so people will do that. But to actually say, I'm going to choose a candidate. I'm going to work for her. I'm going to work for him. I'm going to go maybe work for a civic organization. But to create, we're giving grants for that. We're trying to encourage it. We're hoping to get a few hundred other schools to do so, precisely to avoid the danger you've put your finger on, which is that education can isolate you from the people who need your contributions and who need your participation as a citizen.
More or less on the same subject, would you say that what has happened is a kind of divorce between an intellectual perception of the universe and a very, very critical, fragmented scientific, technological aspect of it? And the human integration and the kind of emotional reaction towards people. So what I got from your thing was that the holism of the human being has been far too fragmented, and people are looking at it critically with the fragments that are at hand. So basically you're talking of more or less an ethical way of looking at being human rather than, so was one of your
Yes, it definitely, you said it so well that I want to just agree with you and say, yes, that is something I'm hoping people will take away from my work. I would only add that that this notion of the education of the whole person in my writing I try to link to pragmatism. So that because sometimes people who talk about the education of the whole person, they define the person or personhood in such a way as to make it less open, and less connected to other parts of nature, let's say. And so I was very influenced by my teacher, Richard Rorty, and I think that you can have this holistic, humanistic approach to education without depending on a foundation, without depending on an essence that would declare some people more human than others, or some people less deserving of being in the polity than others. So, but the idea of the education of the whole person, which is in China, how we talk about liberal education, or how Tagore talked about it here, I think that's absolutely vital.
All right. Can I? No, only 3 hands. So we'll take, okay. We'll begin from here. So we'll complete and move backwards. One small permission, 5 minutes. Can we extend? It is 5 to 8. We can go up to 8:05. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. This is kind of related to your comments on the woke culture that's been taking over. I was just wondering, how do you, at least the way I see it, it seems to be a larger political issue. And Slavoj Žižek has made this point that there is this increased kind of atomization among university students and this unwillingness to engage with so-called problematic texts. Is that a larger political kind of trend that do you see it as being a larger political thing brought by neoliberal capitalism?
Well, I don't know if it's just neoliberal capitalism, but I do think that the atomization of society, or sometimes Zizek talks about it as the privatization of the public sphere, that it does serve people who already have power and money, and that the ability to see interconnections, and he's a master at that, and to not succumb to atomized thinking or atomized ways of living is a way of preserving the possibilities for change.
All right. No, sorry, no new hands. My apologies to those who are raising, but 1, 2 at the end. So we'll go.
So I have a question. So you talk about a student. So how do you see the student and religion relationship from history? and how it increases or decreases the intellectual capacity of a state or a nation when religions influence over the freedom and everything?
Thank you. It's a very broad topic, and I think it makes a difference which religion and in which time period. But I have been told, and I think this is a fair criticism of my approach, that I emphasize so much the individual, thinking for oneself in the company of others, where a more religious orientation in many religious traditions would emphasize a community of believers in some cases, and so that that I have someone said a typical American individualistic approach, and I think that's I'm sorry that's the case, but I think I do tilt towards the individual, and I think with greater attention to religious belonging, which I think is perfectly compatible with the kind of practicing freedom I've described, that the greater attention to religious belonging would be a good thing for me and from my perspective. I spent some time in the book about the connection between these new notions of freedom and education and the development of the nation state. Especially in Germany, and Kant is helpful in this regard. Well, he's helpful about religion too, preserving a space for dissent, whether it's religious dissent or it's political dissent, is absolutely crucial to preserving the capacity to be a student. As the space for dissent shrinks, so does the space for being a student. So there's a space for freedom, I think.
President Roth, I just wanted to say it's so nice to see you in Bangalore. I work at the Azim Premji Foundation, but I'm also a Wesleyan class of 08.
Thank you for coming out.
Of course I had to. But it also means that I'm no longer young enough for you to dismiss my question as the annoying question of a young person. So I do apologize in advance for that. But I think when you were speaking about thinking with freedom, I think what I've often struggled with is when you convert thinking to doing into action. And so I am going to go ahead and ask, I think it'll be really good for everyone here to know that in 2015, Wesleyan's board took a really progressive decision to think about their investments from the perspective of the environment and social issues and governance. And in 2020, Wesleyan made a commitment to divest from fossil fuels in the next 10 years. But President Roth, I also signed the petition for Wesleyan's divestment from companies complicit in human rights abuses in Palestine. And I was just wondering, knowing that the BDS movement is a powerful movement, it's had its successes and failures, but what is your position on this and how do you feel about it? And is this something that you would champion going forward?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for a good Wesleyan question. For those of you, just in case, the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction, only one country, only Israel. And so I'm an opponent of this movement and have been since you were a student. I mean, I think maybe shortly thereafter, because you were there for the Obama, that was your graduation. Yeah, President Obama, then before he was president, spoke at that graduation. I think that the practice of politics, especially in regard to specific events like the horrific war in Gaza right now, through changes in the investment policy, is performative, and I think it's ineffectual, and I think it's a distraction from real issues at hand. On the other hand, I also think that boycotting Israel's scholars and or cultural products as a way of punishing the state for the occupation, which is where it comes from, not just the recent events in Gaza, is ineffective, and I think it's wrong-headed, because I do think that there are many people in Israel, especially in the university system, who would be coming, who are at least as critical of its policies as people outside of the country. And finally, I should say, though, I am appalled by the events in Gaza, but I am also appalled by the fact that many of my students today, and apparently over time, and alumni who sign these petitions, they almost never say, why doesn't Hamas surrender and release the hostages as part of their call for an end of the occupation? And so I don't take seriously. In fact, I'm even offended by the lack of attention to basic human rights on a consistent level, and the focus on just a part of a complex political problem. I do hope, as Ramadan has just begun, that people who are working for peace will do so very effectively and stop this brutal war. I don't think focusing on a smallish university's endowment is a serious way of trying to stop that war.
One final thing, I think. There is one hand, it is here. Okay, so that is the last question.
Hi. So this is a question in the Socrates tradition, in that it's a questioning your research rather than question about your research. I hope you'll humor me on this. So you began your lecture with a disclaimer that you only understand the Western tradition, and therefore that's what your book focuses on. In that when you talk about the history of what being a student means, you can only speak with authority from the Western perspective. But then again, the example you gave is Confucius, who's clearly not Western. And this is something I've noticed in a lot of history books that attempt to provide a sweeping world history of a particular subject. It's always, when they say world history, the book actually only covers European history plus China. And it's somehow always a pattern. That's European history plus China. And so this is something I wanted to ask you. Have you heard this criticism before? And how would you answer that? Like, why does this happen?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think it happens because people like me don't know enough about alternative traditions. I mean, in my case, I've been teaching Confucius in the last decade, and I thought it really made sense, not in the organization of the book, as you rightly point out, because the book is really about Western philosophy. And I don't deal with the South Asia. I don't deal with Jewish traditions. I don't deal with Islamic traditions. And my only defense is that the subtitle is a short history. And but it's not because I think that the traditions on which I focus are more important. It just happens. But I do think that there is a bias in Anglo-American publishing towards works on the traditions closest to hand, and I apologize to being part of that stream of work. It certainly, and I have had people say to me, "Why don't you write another book about you can take 3 other traditions, world traditions," and I think someone should. But I don't think that I would be capable of doing it in a way that those traditions deserve. But it's a fair question.
All right. I think we conclude the questioning with that. We are just 5 minutes beyond the stipulated time. But Professor Roth, I think it has been a very engaging and energetic 100 minutes, and there's very scintillating responses from your side and your way of presentation. I think we all enjoyed it. And may I say, Professor Roth gave a big hand, and I think this is a great opportunity of
Thank you very much.
The privilege of conversation. Thank you.